This is Everyday Discipleship, a podcast whose mission is to equip Christians to live for the glory of Christ from a biblical worldview. My name is Chad Lee. With me is Cole Chanel, and we are two pastors at Reformation Baptist Church in Northwest Arkansas. And today we're going to be discussing communism, and you brought this up as something that you would like to speak on.
Well, I think it seems that every time election season comes around, usually we end up doing a few more political stuff. I think just trying to look at politics and trying to understand our world from a Christian worldview, a biblical worldview, and
the Christian's role in politics.
Yeah, and like I was listening, I'll reference to him. I listen to a lot of political stuff, and I was listening to a few things that were talking about kind of communism, and it's kind of going back even to 2020 of like social justice and all that stuff about how like communist revolution happens. And I don't know, it was like a moment where it just all kind of clicked into place. I thought of a lot of examples recently of kind of like what we're seeing. And so kind of like my idea for this was, as we're kind of going into an election season, words get thrown out there all the time of like communist, socialist, talk about the other side, Marxist. And then I think you get gaslit by like mainstream media and propaganda that says, well, basically if you're saying that, you're crazy. Like the Republicans are a threat to democracy and all that stuff. And so we use these words without really having any concrete anchors for them. And kind of what I wanted to do was talk about what communism is, what Marxism is, and show specific examples of what we're up against. How I do think that there is, like, what we're witnessing a revolution, a communist revolution trying to take place. Now, from the left, from the Democrat side. That's not to say like Republicans are great. I have a lot of problems with them, but I think that there's the old adage, like you blame your enemy for what you yourself are doing. They're always looking at, hey, they're a threat to democracy, existential threat to our way of life, all that stuff. When really, I think is they're totally trying to shine the spotlight away from them and the danger I think they are to our Constitution and to our form of government set up by our founders that God has established, right? That like, we believe in Romans 13 as Christians, but what does that mean? We don't have a king. Our king, our emperor, our Caesar is the Constitution. And I think you're seeing people on the left try to undermine the Constitution, try to disrupt and change the American way of life. And I think, I'll just tell you, like when I was researching for this yesterday, so where are we at? When we're recording this, we're about a month out from the election. Mm-hmm. They just had the vice presidential debate a couple nights ago. When I was researching for this, and you put it all together, I thought to myself, this is insane. Yeah. When you put it all together, it's obvious and clear that what we're witnessing is like a communist revolution attempting to take place, and then we have a responsibility as Christians because communism is diametrically opposed to the Christian worldview. It is,
and this is the beauty of our Constitution, what the founders did, because the government is supposed to be subject to us. We the people.
Supposedly.
Right? The ideal of it.
Yeah, supposedly we're supposed to have representatives that represent us, not dictate to us and tell us what to do.
Yeah, and I think in the VP debate, what you saw was, the progressive Marxist ideologies and principles all the way back in the early 20th century in the public school system, which we'll get into that stuff. But we've been so lulled to sleep.
Yeah.
Like you talk about the Overton window, what's acceptable speech, right? The Marxist ideologies that are just accepted throughout all the colleges started somewhere to where now you start talking about these principles and people are like, oh yeah, like I've heard that for a long time.
Yeah, you don't see how it's in the water.
Yeah.
Right. It's just how many of these ideas, like words like equality, like these words that, how can that be bad? How can anybody be against equality? But that's actually rooting from a Marxist strategy to try to change and disrupt our way of life. So like, I guess kind of what I wanted to do is, I think a little bit explain communism because, listen, if you want to go real insidious with it, I grew up in public school. Probably what I was taught about communism wasn't all that much, just to try to hide it enough. But like, I think a lot of people don't understand what communism actually is, what it actually teaches, and because I think if you don't see the Red Scare, if you don't see that Iron Curtain, the old Soviet type stuff, people speaking Russian, like, well, that's not communism. And so explaining what communism is, kind of like the underlying foundation of it.
If you don't know what a gulag is.
Yeah. But then too, so a little bit defining communism, and then how communism kind of shifted and morphed and how it's working itself out in our world today, and how a communist revolution happens, like what things in society are being attacked and how those things are being attacked, and then really kind of coming at the end of it with what does that look like for Christians to do? So like what can we do? Because I know when you look out at the world, and especially when you start thinking about politics and federal government, obviously we talk about, there are a lot of people say, well, you just need to go local, but the federal government is still dictating a lot of our way of life. So like, we do have to care. We do have to have eyes to see. But what can we do? Because it is a giant monster. Like, we're one person. How can you can't stop a cog in the machine. And especially when I think there's spiritual forces behind what's going on, like what we see in Daniel, right? The spiritual forces where Satan and demons are animating some of these things. But I guess, so to start, would be kind of like a description of what communism is.
Yeah, let's start there.
Because I think it's a boogeyman word a little bit, where, right, communism, socialism, this idea, you hear it. You'll own nothing and be happy. Like the Klaus Schwab, WHO, all that stuff, New World Order type stuff. But what communism really kind of was, it was obviously started by a guy named Karl Marx, right? That's Marxism. Karl Marx lived from 1818 to 1883, and he basically came up with this philosophy or worldview that masqueraded as an economic system, where if you really had to summarize it, and listen, like, you're going to hear some of this stuff, and you're like, oh, that sounds a lot like what I'm hearing today from the left. His whole system could really be kind of summed up in a statement that says justice for the oppressed. Like that's kind of his whole idea, his whole worldview, that he believed. His thing was an economic deal where he believed capitalism was a great evil. That basically in capitalism, you would have the haves and the have-nots, the bigwigs making the money and oppressing the working class, oppressing the poor, basically using them to make profit, not sharing profit, and getting richer and the poor getting poorer. And that he thought history was class warfare, and then he actually believed capitalism was going to collapse in under itself. That eventually the working class would wake up to the oppression they're experiencing, revolt against the dominating class, the oppressor class, and they would take over and they would create this new kind of communist utopia where everyone would share everything, everyone would work for the good of the common man, right? That to each his own ability, right? And to each his own need, that everybody would just kind of do things magically in this magical world where everybody would share everything. And you even see that with in people bring those ideas in Christian churches of, like, they'll look at Acts 2 and look, they had everything in common. 2. And so it's basically Christian communism. Like, why aren't we doing that? Isn't that a Christian ideal? And so that's one of the ways I think it's infiltrated the church somewhat. But basically, they're trying to build this utopia by getting rid of this oppressor class. That there's this war between the oppressor and the oppressed. And, you hear that language today with not just economic forces, and that's kind of what we're going to get into, how it's working itself out. But that was his view. And, there's things, you can see how this idea of the equality was central. This egalitarianism was central, that there should not be one over another.
Yeah, it's the goal of eliminating hierarchy.
Yeah, eliminating hierarchy and everyone being equal and everyone having everything. Because the reason that there are haves and have-nots is because people are selfish and they need to share more and work for the common good. And so he believed that you could bring in this communist utopia. And even I think thought that, when you talk about communism and political revolution, what they kind of view is you need to have the working class wake up, throw off the chains, so to speak, and then establish a dictatorship to kind of get that transition happen, right? Someone that is moving it forward, and then that would eventually lead to a basically utopia of government and state where the state was taking care of everything and the state was working in the best interest of the people. But the problem is dictators don't like to give up power, and it all ends up being corrupt. And
the irony of, well, then you have another hierarchy.
Yeah, but under the guise of this other stuff. But basically the idea, the utopia is this socialist or communist state where the whole philosophy of Marxism is that man is the center and that man can build heaven on earth, that man can build this new world of egalitarianism and prosperity and blessing for everybody involved. And you hear that and you're like, that just sounds like a Tower of Babel. Because like Marx, he wanted to get rid of religion. That there's a lot of threats he saw to the communist deal, that basically the problem was that the working class was not waking up because of certain factors in life. There are certain things that need to be removed societally, and one of those things was religion. That he would call religion the opiate of the masses. And there's several reasons for that. That because religion teaches that there is a better world after this, right? That would lull the working class to sleep. Because religion taught that there is a higher authority and a God, that would impede any kind of communist work going on, because the state, if there's a God over the state is not God. And the state has to be God to be able to enact or bring in this new world, this promised land of communist utopia. So just right there, like the two views of Christianity and Marxism are diametrically opposed. Religion needs to be get out of the way. And the whole idea of it is you have to tear down the old system that is working in favor of the oppressors, that everything is about oppressor and oppress. You got to tear down the old system, because the whole old system is always bent towards the oppressor class and in favor of the oppressor class, and it's always going to try to crush and stamp down the oppressed class, the working class. And you can that's how they use and justify violence and coercion to try to get to their ends, because they're working for an ultimate human good, right? So violence is acceptable. Killing people is acceptable. That stand in the way of this, because you're standing in the way of human flourishing, right? You're standing in the way of a better world for all people. And you see that a lot in our culture, like where hate, bigot, right? All these people standing in the way, the wrong side of history, that kind of language.
Oh, man, I know you'll get into examples, but during COVID, the unvaccinated are standing in the way.
Yeah, the unvaccinated are a problem. Like things like that of totalitarian control. And, you could even, and communism will use that. I think that's like one of the dangers. Like communism, because it doesn't submit to God and it hates people at the end of the day, it is extraordinarily violent. I mean, I Googled it, like how many people have been killed by communism. And Google's not obviously, they censor things. They're not obviously an unbiased source. And so if you look at it, it's anywhere from 10 to 20 million have been killed by communist states to 148 million, right? But I even saw this past week where there's a missionary in China on Cross Politic, and he said that China has aborted 330 million babies. 330 million babies. Well, China's a communist state. So you're talking like, it's not just 10 to 20 million, 138 million. That might be like lining them up in a mass grave and shooting them in the back of the head and putting them in there. But you're talking like hundreds of millions of people have died from a communist idea where the state is over everything, that there is no God. They're not accountable to God. They don't have to give an answer to God. And so the state becomes God and can do whatever they want. And anything that stands in the way of the state now becomes basically the fall. Basically, you deserve wrath and condemnation, and you're going to get shown wrath and condemnation. So that's kind of the idea of Marxism, in that what happened was, though, capitalism didn't collapse in on itself like Marx thought it would. And so what you had was basically Marxian disciples, particularly like in the 1920s with Antonio Gramsci in the Frankfurt School. Okay, they come in and they're realizing, well, this communist revolution isn't happening like we thought it would. And so maybe we need to change tactics. Maybe we need to try to basically light the spark other ways, wake the oppressed up other ways. And the idea was, we have to, because all the pillars of society are basically holding up this capitalist system, we then need to crumble it at its foundations. So instead of just trying to overthrow capitalism, let's actually take over these pillars of society. Let's infiltrate these pillars of society. Let's change the way these pillars of society operate and work, and then bring everything crumbling down, and then we can build a new communist utopia. And so these pillars of society, and by the way, like a great explanation of this, I mean, I know Vodi Bakum has said a lot on this. I think he has a sermon from Founders called Cultural Marxism. Another really good one, the first hour of it at least, and now this is not a Christian podcast, and there's going to be some language in it, but like Sean Ryan show, he had a guy named John Gentry, it's like number 134, where he, I think in the first hour really explains kind of how some of this stuff is talking about. They're on that episode talking about propaganda and misinformation and how this stuff has happened. And he even like talks about how this stuff really accelerated with Obama. When Obama got in office, that's when you really started seeing this stuff with DEI programs being adopted by the government, and that really kind of being the push of it. But basically the big picture of how how these Marxist ideas and how communist ideas are trying to take over is we need to foment division. We need to foment the class struggle between the oppressor and the oppressed, not just in the economic realm, but in every realm. We need to divide people up into subgroups. We need to have them fighting against each other. That way they will wake up by having this chaos and this division. They will wake up to the oppressors, and they will help overthrow this system so that we can build a new system. And,
trying to install anarchy.
Yeah, basically install anarchy so you can build up a new utopia.
Tear down that system so you can build.
And that's where you get identity politics, where everything is identity politics. Everything is, and even the Republicans like fall into that trap all the time. That everything is, this group, this group, this group. How do they pull with this group? What does this group want? And it's just been, it's that way intentionally, and it's that way intentionally for a reason.
Yeah. Because
it's trying to dismantle everything. Right. Because you see it today. Like, I mean, we mentioned you'll own nothing and be happy. You hear a lot about the talk about the common good. You hear a lot of talk about equality. You hear
talk about they're all of our kids.
All of our kids, the community's kids.
They're not your kids. They're all of our kids.
The state, yeah. Billionaires need to pay their fair share. Mm-hmm. Like, right, Bernie Sanders ran on that. Kamala Harris is running that.
That was in the VP debate.
I will make billionaires pay their fair share, even though billionaires pay way more taxes than anybody else, right? And listen, don't get me started on taxes, because I think anything more than 10%, according to the Bible, is tyranny.
It's oppressive. Yeah, and Walt's hammered that. We got to tax the billionaires more.
Yeah, because they're the oppressor class. And that's where you get like the critical race theory stuff, the social justice stuff, this language of colonialism and imperialism that white colonizers, right? Of you get all these DEI programs in corporations that are talking about homosexuality and transgenderism and hate speech and all this stuff. I mean, that's what you're talking about. All this stuff is not just, I think sometimes people look at it and they go, oh, the world's going insane. And the world is going insane, but it's all also meticulous. It's all also intentional. Now, I should be clear. Like, I think this is where it blinds people too. I don't think there's some like smoke-filled backroom dark cabal going, okay, how are we going to do this now? How are we going to manipulate the military-industrial complex? How are we going to manipulate the CIA, the FBI, the education system, all these universities? How are we going to manipulate the media? I don't think there's some back room trying to figure this out. I think that this has been a long play from people that hold, right, you had advocates, you had sympathizers, and you had useful idiots, right, dupes. That have promoted these ideas for a long time. And so you don't have some dark room cabal. What you have is people all drinking this water and educated and discipled in the system. And so they don't need to meet to figure it out. They're all pulling the same direction because they all have the same interest. They all have the same goals. So, like, I think, because the media will gaslight you and saying, like, they'll deny the communist stuff. They'll say it's like a right-wing talking point. But this is undoubtedly what we're seeing in the world today. Because, like, the five pillars that basically have society that communists, hey, how are we going to get a revolution? How are we going to make this thing happen? Tear down the old, bring in the new. The five pillars are education, press, so media, law, religion, and family units. Family units. These are the things that need to be taken over and reformed to fit into, because these are inhibitors to the New World Order, but also can be taken over and reformed to be catalyzers that help actually bring in this communist Marxist revolution. So, like, education, for example, would be the long-term play. Mm-hmm. The idea is the children today are the leaders 20, 30, 40 years from now. So get them when they're moldable, teach them these ideas, grow them up in this water, and then they will be carrying that water for you later. Because you can't, listen, it's like you can't, in the Cold War, the Russians aren't going to come in and just change America's way of life. I mean, well, you should be communist now. But if you get kids buying into communist ideas and finding it to be right, things like finding it to be compassionate, finding it to be the compassionate way, that we shouldn't, that we should care for the poor. Of course we should care for the poor.
Yeah, see, this is interesting when you talk about education, because the Battle for the American Mind, written by Pete Hegseth and Goodwin of ACCS, the Association of Classical Christian Schools, they went through and talked about, from the founding, what was taught in schools, which are mostly started by churches. So there's a biblical worldview, there's God's creation, there's obviously the gospel. And then as the country continued to grow, and you had all these schools and all these kids learning a biblical worldview and education from a biblical worldview, science from a biblical worldview, right? The progressives in the late 19th century and the 20th century with the Marxist communist policies that you're talking about. So we've got to get God out of the public school system.
Yeah.
Similar to our podcast 2 weeks ago on biblical counseling. Right? We've got to get the Bible out of this so that we can push forth our agenda.
Yeah.
And they have been successful. Right?
We can't, like, you get controversy over saying one nation under God on the Pledge of Allegiance.
Yeah.
Which Pledge of Allegiance replaced prayer? Yeah. I mean, like basically a praise for the state over praise of God.
I saw pamphlets of, before this progressive takeover in the education system, the teachers were handed out catechism tracts on how to actually teach the children catechism questions, biblical.
Which you could talk about, because like that's the problem with like government schools. Because I think all of us would say like, I don't want the government anywhere near teaching religion. Which obviously they were not in it. No.
Right. And then when the government took over, they said, oh, well, now we've got authority here.
Yeah.
And I don't want,
it's like, you don't want like government Christian schools. What you want is education being brought back into the family realm. And that's the thing, like the government, that's what communist state does. Communist state has to be daddy, has to be mommy, has to take care of everything, has to get his hands in everything. Like there shouldn't be a Department of Education. There should not be a federal Department of Agriculture. Like those things should be reserved according to our system, a federalist system, underneath the states, right? That the education is a family unit thing, that all this stuff, but the government wants to creep in, take over so that they can control people and enslave people, basically. And when you talk about like education, that's why government schools were specifically a Marxian idea. And they accomplished a few purposes, because what government schools would do would be get the kids away from mom, get the kids away from dad, make them as much children of the state as they are of their own family unit.
Which is what they are.
40
hours a week.
Yeah. And then you also get mom out in the workforce, so she's not at home thinking homeward, and then you're just totally disrupting the family unit, all in this like you're killing two birds with one stone. So you have education as one of the pillars, you have law as one of the pillars. The goal of law is to start making the law work in your favor, like get rid of equal scales of justice, don't have that blind lady justice, and you need to get the law to start enforcing or coercing your new definition of justice. Redefine justice, which is what we've seen in social justice. Like redefine what justice is and start getting the law to bend towards that. You talk about, hey, bake a cake, bake the gay cake, bake the gay wedding cake, and you have to bake the gay wedding cake.
Yeah, you get lawfare.
Now he's won that.
We're going to keep suing you.
He's won that, but he's in court all the time. And it happens all the time.
Yeah, I mean, when you see now with Trump, that's the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, and we're
trying to continue to sue him.
Yeah. And then you got religion, like infiltrate religion. We already talked about, you got to get God out. God is going to be an inhibitor to this whole Marxist idea. And then you got the family unit. You have to destroy the family unit, because families make up communities, which makes up societies, which makes up towns, which makes up cities, which makes up nations. I mean, the family unit is the bedrock of everything. So if you want to have a communist takeover, you got to destroy the family unit. You have that. It takes a village idea. Individual families, you got to destroy that, because without families, the mortar of society, the mortar of culture is gone. There is nothing. I think Doug Wilson will say, like, we're not molecules, we're just a bag of BBs, easily moldable, easily pushed around, easily shaped into whatever the state would want us to be shaped in. And so the idea is you got to get all five of these and working on all five of these, and they're all a long play, because they're all standing in the way of the revolution. And I think what's crazy is, when you look at these five kind of pillars, all of these are under attack today.
I mean, you could spend episodes just talking about each one of those individually.
Yeah.
And the examples of how our Marxist, leftist policies have destroyed the family, and get into feminism and get into all of these things.
Well, let's get into some of those, because like there are specific examples. And that's like one of the things I wanted to do was, hey, let's look at specific examples of these things, because when you put it all on paper, it's insane. It's crazy.
But you've been so lulled to sleep on this as the American culture that it's like, oh, well, I guess this is our new norm.
And it's like the media is like, you can't believe your own eyes. It's not a communist revolution. It's not a communist takeover. These people are not communists because they don't wear red. right? They don't
Yeah.
speak with a Russian accent, but that's not the point. I'm not even saying they're openly communist, because there is still a Communist Party of the USA. They still put out a newspaper even today. But it's like, I'm not saying the Democrats are openly communist. What I'm saying is they are absolutely infiltrated with Marxist ideas and communist ideas.
Yeah.
So they're not out there saying, hey, we're communists, but all their ideas and all their ways of thinking and all their policies are definitively communist. And they're using every avenue they have to push and I think destroy what we have as a government, as a nation that God's established. So like education, public schools, our government schools, they promote state ideas, that they have sex education. Young, I remember getting sex education as a fourth grader in a conservative school district. And our parents had to sign off on a video. Why is the government teaching that to children? Well, I'll tell you,
What leads to this now?
Destroy the family unit.
Destroy the
because
family
we want
unit now.
kids. We want kids. We want them having sex, and we want them to not, because sex is the mortar of a family. Is the thing that bonds a family together. Let's destroy that. Let's make sex cheap or whatever, and you don't have families anymore. You don't need to have a family to have sex.
No, and then you have abortion,
Sexual promiscuity, and then you got, right? We've seen it. Sexual books, LGBTQ books in libraries that the Democrats always fight to be taken out. And what do they say? Book burning, censorship. They always call us out on that side of it, saying like, you guys are just fascists, you're just Nazis.
Yeah.
Because why? They want that in there.
And now it's just assumed that the government has the right to teach children what is right and wrong about sex.
Yeah.
What is sexually healthy.
And what else do you see? Like, you see all the crazy blue hair liberal women teaching kids. What they got? They got pride flags in the classrooms. They got Black Lives Matter flags in the classrooms. They're talking about using pronouns. You got the state that will say, hey, like California, the school doesn't have to tell your parents if the kid is going by a different name and different gender in the school because they're getting attention from it. I mean, all this stuff is part of this destabilization of America and this communist takeover. And even the teaching evolution. Because what's teaching evolution say? There is no creator. You are nothing. You matter nothing. And then we're surprised that like school shootings happen or that kids are depressed.
Yeah, after they've been taught for 15 years.
That they're
really
nothing and there's no
matter.
significance to their life whatsoever.
Yeah.
And so, and then that's even like in the little schools, right? All the way up through. And then you got universities that produce just absolute abject Marxist. Like kids coming out of university today are Marxist communists. And they espouse all the ideas of Marxist communists.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And all that stuff is a part of a plan. You talk about the press, media. I mean, Trump really hammered it in 2016 with like fake news. But it's kind of true. No one trusts the media anymore.
No, I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but their approval stats and the number of people that actually trust them has gone way down.
Well, and it's all propaganda and misinformation. And they'll say, well, the right is spreading misinformation, right? You have censorship on social media and all that stuff. But really, if you look at mainstream media, it's all Democrat talking points. In everything, even when you watch these last two debates, the questions are assuming the premise of Democrat talking points in favor of Democrat talking points.
Yeah.
Like all the fact checks that the media will do. Well, we're fact checking, but their fact checks are total lies. And they don't cover things equally the same. I mean, when Trump got assassinated, or not got assassinated, but when they tried to assassinate him the first time,
Yeah.
which is crazy, you even have to say that. When they tried to assassinate him the first time, you'd like CNN be like, Trump fell down.
Yeah.
He was shot in the head, in the ear.
Yeah.
And just like all these blatant lies.
It's telling you not to believe what your eyes just saw.
Yeah, and like, yeah, right? What'd you have? The Hunter Biden laptop story. Oh, the Hunter Biden laptop is Russian misinformation. Well, now we're finding out, no, it's not Russian misinformation. It's all true.
And all the censorship that happened around the laptop.
Oh, my gosh.
Like, don't believe your eyes on that.
You had the media saying that Trump was a Russian asset, basically, and that he only got elected that first time for 4 years. 4 years of just, hey, Russian disinformation, Russian interference in our elections. And none of that was true.
Yeah, it really is. You said it earlier, the daddy state. Like, the government and the media saying, no, like, we're really trying to help you. Like, we're trying to do this for you. We're trying to protect you.
Yeah. And that's why people give up their freedoms, because they don't want to take responsibility for their own life. They want to be taken care of. They don't want to, right, take responsibility for themselves, do what God's called them to do.
Yeah, which is it's very effeminate.
Yeah.
So that's why you have a lot of men who are very effeminate and don't actually want to stand up and do what God's called them to do, because we've grown up in this culture that said, well, we'll take care of you.
Yeah. Well, and think about, so, you talk about education, you talk about press, you talk about law. I mean, how much the law and the Department of Justice and FBI and CIA have been turned against the American people. Listen, I know I'm fully aware that if I'm not already on a watch list, this episode will probably get me on a watch list because the way AI works, they're probably going to be able to find this pretty easy.
Sure.
But think about it. All the lawfare against Trump, trying to imprison your political rivals, political opponents. Listen, that's not normal behavior. That's not normal life. That is communist stuff. Because you have to eliminate opposition to your power and your total control. Because until that's there will always be resistance to you. You had government partnering with you had the government partnering with social media companies to censor misinformation, quote unquote, about COVID, misinformation, quote unquote, about elections. You had vaccine mandates, particularly in the military. You had vaccine
extreme coercion.
Yeah. Like you can't you have, how else is the law, right? The government's job is to be a minister of justice, to punish the evildoer and promote the good. But what do you have? You have Antifa, Black Lives Matter, burning down cities.
The riots of 2020.
Billions of dollars in damage, insanity. But then...
And the woman that's running for president let them out.
Oh my gosh. Well, but then you have, like, on the other side, what do you have? You have this constant push about January 6th and about that being a threat to democracy and people in prison without a speedy trial, constitutional rights being violated. You have abortion protesters like the Nashville 10 being charged with a federal FACE Act and being thrown in federal prison.
For many years.
Because they stood in the way, because they're saying you're blocking the entrance to an abortion clinic. And what's the government doing?
A murder clinic.
Hey, we're gonna imprison these people trying to stop murder, and we're going to actively help these other people trying to commit murder, right? And you have that we talked about the baking cakes. Listen, this is what's insane too. I got on the FBI's website and looked up domestic terrorism and looked up their packet and like what are symbols of domestic terrorism? Symbols of domestic terrorism, according to them, are things like the Gadsden flag, the Don't Tread on Me flag, things like Second Amendment paraphernalia, or the Come and Take It cannon, things like Revolutionary War imagery. And they like make it clear, like if you just having these doesn't make you a domestic terrorist, but these are things commonly used by domestic terrorists.
Yeah, I know that all of your guns have been drowned in a lake somewhere, but
I don't have any weapons.
Yeah, I know they're gone. But the flags, I looked at the flags. Somebody had a great meme on all these flags. I've got to get more, but I've got a few of them that are on that list.
Well, so think about it. Like all these things that the federal government is classifying these people. And remember, whenever people are going into school board meetings, this is a big story. People are going into school board meetings, protesting what school boards were doing, what school boards were allowing in their libraries. And the FBI put them on, labeled them as domestic terrorists, labeled them as threats. People trying to take care of their kids. And, you had, I think it was in Virginia, and that's how Youngkin, I think, won. You had the Democrat person saying, they're not your kids. And that's why he lost. That's like why that guy lost.
Saying, they're our kids.
And, even in the VP debate a couple nights ago, Tim Walz openly saying, we need to criminalize hate speech and misinformation. Criminalize hate speech. Who gets to find what hate speech is? Because I'll guarantee you who gets to find it. It's them. Because you already see with hate crimes, right? This was just back this past summer. In Spokane, my wife's family is from Spokane. In Spokane, they did a Pride Month crosswalk, right? And some teenagers skidded out on it, basically defaced it.
Good for them.
Because they didn't like it. And they got arrested. That's hate speech. That's hate crimes. That's what's going to happen. And you even have like Hillary Clinton on MSNBC openly saying, quote, this is a quote from her, that she suggested that they should be, quote, civilly or criminally charged if you promote propaganda, according to her definition, or misinformation, according to her definition.
Yeah, I mean, we're only a few steps behind the UK right now, who they actively go after people who post things that go against the Marxist narrative on social media.
Like, you literally can be thrown in jail, and their prime minister brags about it, be thrown in jail for what you say about the Muslim takeover of their nation. Yeah. It has hate speech. And if you have any doubt, like they're trying to absolutely destabilize and take over, and I don't know if really this is Democrats or whatever. Like, what is Kamala Harris running on right now? Pack the courts, pack the Supreme Court, basically nullify the power of the Supreme Court, make it a puppet state.
But why? So that we can obviously push our agenda. But what is their agenda?
Not be challenged at all.
Kill babies, so we can absolutely
get rid of the filibuster, our way of life, like get rid of that part of our decorum of our Senate to put Roe into effect federally over every state. And so, the law one is insane, how much you've really seen, how much inroads they've made there. The religion one, on MSNBC, there was a Politico reporter that said, if you believe your rights come from God, you are a Christian nationalist. They're trying to oppress Christians. They're trying to make Christians look like crazy right-wing fanatics as threats to democracy, as threats, because they cannot have, again, that's what we saw, they cannot have a people that have a faith in a higher power. They cannot have that. It is diametrically opposed to their worldview. That's where you get all this information about this constant barrage of separation of church of state, freedom of religion. Separation of church of state never meant the government is not accountable to God.
No.
It never meant that we could not talk publicly about our faith, or that you need to keep your faith out of politics. What it meant was the government would not establish a state religion and persecute other denominations.
Yeah, see that word, religion and denominations, you could do. We might even do a podcast on that someday, right? But the founders didn't have in view Hinduism or Islam.
Yeah.
They had in view Baptists, Presbyterians, Anglicans.
When the states ratified the Bill of Rights, there were multiple states that still had state denominations. They were getting rid of a federal denomination because we didn't want a Church of England like a Church of the United States.
Correct.
But even and even Shepherds, like Meg Basham came out with a book called Shepherds for Sale that talks about how Democrats have made inroads into churches and into false teachers using money and trying to promote Democrat ideas under a Christian guise to try to basically convert the Christian church into a communist propaganda machine. And so you have that going on, and again, this isn't even just our stuff. Okay, I think some people can think, well, you guys are just nuts. You're the right-wing guys, whatever. So Tulsi Gabbard was on, again, Sean Ryan's show, and he did an interview with her, and she's not on our side, right? She was a former Democrat, now probably call herself an independent. Sean Ryan basically asked her, why do they do this? Why do the Democrats do this? Why do they push like this? This is a quote, verbatim from her, okay? She said, they want to be God. They want to be the ultimate master. They want to be the ultimate creator. They want to be controller of all that they survey. That's her assessment of the Democrat Party. That's what we're talking about. The state has to be God. There can be no higher power.
And that's the definition of a wicked ruler.
Yeah.
A righteous ruler knows, Psalm 2, like, I am to kiss the Son. Lest I perish in the way.
Yeah. And so you have education, law, you have religion, press, and then you got family. But the family has been so absolutely destroyed by what the federal government has done. You could talk about how the federal government has destroyed, listen, they want to do identity politics all day, has destroyed the black family with the welfare state, incentivizing men to not take care of their kids by being a nanny state that provides the needs for people. And then you have like the sexual revolution in the culture. You have Obergefell being passed, which allowed gay marriage, which totally does dismantle marriage itself.
It does, but think of how the reactions you would get in our culture today with the simple statement that's been throughout: sex should be in the context of marriage.
Yeah.
And the looks that you get. Don't have sex outside of marriage. We've come so far from that.
Well, and that's what I think a lot of it really does center on sexual morality. That I
agree with that.
That the family unit's been destroyed by, gay marriage, transgender madness. You try to make kids of the state. You, like in California, you can take kids away from parents if they don't affirm
their sexual identity. Exactly.
So who ultimately has those kids? It's not the parents. We're basically custodians of the state. Our kids, according to the state, belong to the state. You have abortion on demand. You have the rise of feminism, and you have basically the promotion of weak and soft men that should not stand up and should not lead their homes. You have cohabitation being normalized, pornography being rampant, that no-fault divorce. All these things have effectively tried to destroy the family. And so all these pillars are under attack. And you see like and all these things are under attack, I would say predominantly, not exclusively, because I think the Republicans do a lot of stuff too that basically buy into some of these same ideals because they're cowards, but predominantly from the left are actively pushing and destroying these things.
And foundational tenets of Marxism.
Well, and all their policies are, because what's the goal? You have to take over these pillars, but you also need to bring in you bring in instability in the culture. And we have that. How much division there is in the culture, illegal immigration coming into the culture, always talking about climate change, always talking about gun restrictions, like all these things that divide. You have their side going, Trump is an existential threat to democracy over and over again, and they don't stop their rhetoric, right? They will call him literally Hitler, but then it obviously then when there's an assassination attempt on his life, I'm so glad he's safe. Well, which one is it? It can't be both.
Yeah.
You can't be glad Hitler is safe. He's either literally Hitler or you're glad he's safe. But you have this ramp up in tension, and you even have things like, here's how normalized it's become. Here's how insane it's become. The New York Times, there's been 3 articles. I'll tell you, it's like there's been 3 articles the New York Times has published just out there openly, like it's no big deal. One was called, from July 2024, "The First Amendment is out of control." And you have
free speech is out of control.
Free speech is out of control. This one's from August 2023. "Elections are bad for democracy." You have, and then this was just recent, August 31st, 2024. This is literally a quote. "The Constitution is sacred." So the foundation of our government is sacred. "The Constitution is sacred. Is it also dangerous? One of the biggest threats to America's politics might be the country's founding document." That is an article they published.
It is dangerous to communism.
And so they are obviously trying to tear down to rebuild a new communist state. And so that's what we're up against. I mean, and again, they are spouting explicitly Marxist ideas. So you have tons of examples, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She literally will say all the time, "We have a world to win. We have a world to win." That is a line that comes from the German translation at the end of the Communist Manifesto written by Karl Marx, openly saying it. And then you got Kamala Harris, the presidential candidate for the Democrats, who wasn't voted by one single delegate in her party, that was just put in there, right? That she was, there's the compilation clip, because she says it all the time, and she kind of got mocked for it. What can be unburdened by what has been.
Oh, yeah.
Right? What can be unburdened by what has been. That's such a stupid statement that people just kind of laugh it off and like, oh, look how crazy and look how funny she is. What's she saying? She is saying what can be the utopia unburdened by what has been. We can tear it all down. We can start it over. We can start fresh. That's communist. That's Marxist ideas. And so the idea being, I think what we're seeing right now in culture is a full court press. It's not some giant conspiracy, but all these people have been discipled this way. They've been trained this way. They've been raised up in these waters, brought in these waters. That's why when we talk about on this episode all the time, the answer to this problem is not going to be politics. You can't just vote this stuff out. People need to be born again. They need new eyes to see. They need the gospel. They need to be shown the truth.
Yeah, I mean, because to take AOC's line, we have a world to win.
Yeah, Christ is winning the world.
Yeah.
He is going to grow his kingdom, right, until it is greater. Like the mustard seed is going to be greater than all the kingdoms of the world.
Leaven's going to fill the whole loaf.
But what we're in, I think the encouragement I wanted to give was really to define some of this stuff for people. Like, oh man, this is a huge deal. We are really in it. We're really up against it.
Well, it's a good reminder too, because we can be lulled to sleep because it's everywhere. It's out there. We can become desensitized to it. So it's good to be reminded of.
When I think like on the Steve Day show, he's a Christian that does a political commentary show, and they talk all the time about how we are too lazy to be citizens anymore. That as citizens, we have a responsibility to our nation, our neighbor. And how many Christians have been told, like, my kingdom's not of this world, so don't even worry about it. That's not the way we're supposed to live. We're supposed to take up our civil responsibilities to our neighbor and to live out our civil responsibilities from a Christian worldview. But also I want to encourage people, because I think what you're seeing is not just the folly of man, the foolishness of man. I think there's an absolute spiritual warfare element to this. That there are, like I said, I don't think there's some diabolical, like, people talk about Klaus Schwab and George Soros, that like, hey, are these guys pulling all the strings and they know everything going on. I think a lot of this is people that are smart and they know what they're doing. I think a lot of it is dupes and people that are just kind of going along with the flow. But I think a lot of it is spiritual warfare behind the scenes. And a lot of the stuff you see, like Steve Deace, he'll talk about a lot, how the turmoil and the craziness you're seeing is the unseen realm spilling over into the seen realm. And you're really starting to see how this is a spiritual battle and a spiritual war. And so then that brings up the question, right? Because you can complain about problems all the time. What does that actually mean for us? Like, what can we do right now? Because I think about that. I think about, how can you? I have no power to do with the election. Like even your one vote, depending on how secure you think our elections are. Which again, there's another part about destabilizing like our whole nation, that you can't even bring up election security without being labeled as a conspiracy theorist. You can't even question, hey, are elections secure? Hey, are illegal aliens voting? Are illegal immigrants voting in our elections and affecting our elections? If you start bringing that stuff up, people will think because of what the media said, you're insane. Even they can't even pass the SAVE Act in Congress that basically says only American citizens should vote in our elections. That was a divisive issue somehow, some way. Why? Because
we've been swimming in this so long.
It thwarts their ends. You can't. They're trying to do something, and that would be another obstacle to be put in the way. So of course, the Democrats are not going to vote for that, and they're not going to approve that.
I mean, if you look at historically the communist leaders killing political opponents, it's just foolish to think that they're not going to go after the election, the system, and do what they can to manipulate the system to get their own.
Well, the fact that for the first time, 2020 was like, it takes days to figure out the election when that's never happened before.
Yeah.
When you have like third world countries compared to us figuring out that same day, it only invites fishiness. Like that. That's like what I always say: be above reproach. If you don't want people questioning or wondering, is our election really secure? Make it where it's obviously it has to be. Like don't do things that obviously invite questions, right? And so what can we do as citizens? Obviously, in a month we can vote. I mean, I saw Barna said that from their polling, only 59% of Christians plan on voting.
Oof.
Only 59, and that's not even like, listen, we're insane. I grant that. That's not even like conservative Reformed Baptist guys and Presbyterians voting. That's just people that identify as Christians, call themselves Christians. Which that's like the Joel Osteen Church, the mainline denominations,
David French's,
all of them, right? So like only 59% of them are actually going to be voting, and I do think voting is a civic responsibility. Now, I would not burden someone's conscience to say you have to go. We did that episode. I don't think you have to go vote Republican. I think there's some people that have a moral conscience. Their conscience will not allow them to because of the Republicans' horrible stance on abortion.
Their wicked stance on
right?
Abortion.
But if we are, then we need to start looking at our world from a biblical worldview and not checking the Bible at the door of the voting booth. That we need to actually think about these things from a biblical standard and work through those prayerfully. And I think another thing we do is pray, right? The Bible tells us to pray for our leaders, that we cannot affect anything, but we can pray to God, and He hears us, He listens to us. And then I think really this is probably what I would focus on most. Invest in your sphere of influence in those 5 areas that we talked about as much as you can. So what does that look like? Obviously, some of them are going to be less, some of them are going to be more. When you talk about the law, I would just say, would you have like what Paul says, would you have no fear of the one who is in authority than do what is good? Be a law-abiding citizen. Submit and obey the authorities that God has placed over us, right? And then pray for our leaders, like 1 Timothy 2 says. Pray for them that they would be converted. Pray for them that we could live a peaceful life. And then the press, be wise as serpent, innocent as doves. Pay attention to what you're listening to. Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world. I mean, I think you and I, like people like us, are a little bit more in it, and so we're not the normie voter. But I know we talk about it. We have conversations with Christians all the time that just kind of buy into these mainstream media ideas and mainstream media talking points. They still assume
the best with them.
And from a Christian perspective and Christian worldview. And so I think being wise as a servant and realize the lie is the point. They're like, I think Eric Weinstein, he's not a Christian. He's a liberal. Eric Weinstein talks about the lie is the point. They're not lying to you. They're instructing you. They're training you. They're discipling you. That's the idea. Don't be conformed to this world, right? Have your mind renewed with the Bible. Be transformed by the renewal of your mind. I think with education, we as Christians have to take responsibility for educating our kids from a Christian worldview. The government school, like there was a big thing. I can't remember who it was. I think she's at Matt Chandler's church or whatever, but it was Jen Wilkin talking about, hey, our kids need to be missionaries in public schools. No, they don't.
Foolish.
They don't. They are not meant to be missionaries. They need to be raised up and discipled. Yeah. They need to be trained. They are not meant to be fighting these wars yet. We're supposed to be fighting these wars for them.
Yeah,
we're supposed to be training them up.
This goes back to 2 weeks ago. Who are you getting your counsel from?
Yeah, and so I think you need to be wary of government schools and what's being pushed, what's being educated. I think take responsibility for your kids' education. I think having a goal of putting your kids in a Christian education, whether it's private Christian education or homeschooling. I think taking responsibility with your children's education and working towards that. And then with religion, right? You have Christians that aren't even joined to a local church, aren't even members of a local church, don't even make worship on Sunday morning a priority week in and week out. They don't make their own personal worship and devotion to the Lord an all-encompassing reality in their life, that they aren't living all their lives for the glory of God. So I would say if you want to be fighting against this, pushing against this, if you're doing what you can in your sphere of influence, the main things you have is educating your children, taking responsibility for that, going to church, joining a church, showing up on Sundays, being involved in the life of that church, committing to the life of that church and worshiping God, and then with family. That's the key, right? Love your wife, submit to your husband, raise your children in fear and admonition of the Lord.
Confess and repent and forgive often.
Confess, repent, forgive often. Practice family worship. Catechize your kids. Disciple your kids. Don't rely on the church to spiritually train up your kids. Listen, that is a great joy. We want to do that, but it will not work if parents are not doing it themselves.
Yeah, dad's the shepherd of the home.
Build your home as a man with an idea of spiritual legacy. Like, I used to hear guys talk about it, and I never really got it. I never really understood it, but I really do. I pray for my children's children. And the way I look at my kids and how I'm raising my kids and how I'm leading my family is, what do I want them doing with their kids? Because what do I want them doing after I'm gone? What do I want my grandkids' home to look like? And I'm trying to model that right now and actually doing that right now. And I think we trust the Lord, right? You pray, you trust the Lord. We know it doesn't mean that America's going to go to the end of time or whatever, but we trust what God's doing, and we trust that the kingdom is going to work itself through like leaven, and that God is sovereign, and he's going to work and overcome all his enemies.
Yeah, regarding the home, it's taking pride in building a Christian culture, a joyful, Christ-honoring Christian culture in the home.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I know it's been a lot. Like, it's like kind of like a little bit of a ranting thing, but I hope it's been beneficial. I also hope it's been a little bit encouraging and maybe a little bit eye-opening, because I guess my final word of it would be, if you're disturbed by the insanity we kind of laid out of how these pillars are being attacked right now, then as much as you're disturbed is as much you need to invest in those pillars in your own life.
Yeah.
And make it a priority for you. Like, you're talking about the home, talking about your kids, talking about your marriage, talking about your religion, your church life, all that stuff. Like, as much as you're disturbed, don't just get lulled to sleep and be like, well, I can't do anything about it, so figure it out. No, do what you can. Take responsibility for yourself and pray what the Lord would do.
Yeah.
And because at the very least, right, what are we called to be? A light.
Salt and light.
Salt and light.
I think this is good because we can get so desensitized to it because it's around us constantly, social media. It can lead to fears, anxieties, worries. And Christians can lose heart. Whenever the beauty of our Christian faith is ours is the faith of hope and love, joy, peace. We're not to fret because Christ is on the throne. He wins. He's already won. Right? His kingdom's going to grow like leaven, like a mustard seed, like you said. But this is good because it helps you not just be desensitized. We actually need to be actively engaging with the spiritual weapons that God has given us.
Yeah.
So that's good. Well, we hope that this discussion has been a blessing to you. And until next time, this is Everyday Discipleship.